This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for August 20th, 2022. I want to take a look at this U.S. Department of Defense background briefing dated August 19th, 2022, and they're announcing yet another aid package to Ukraine. This one is $775 million, and this is following an August 8th package that consisted of $1 billion in aid. It includes additional ammunition for the HIMARS, this multiple launch rocket system sent to Ukraine, 16 launchers in total. They're not sending any more launchers. 16 seems to be the magic number the US thinks Ukraine needs to turn the tide of this conflict. They're just sending ammunition, additional ammunition for it. The Russian Ministry of Defense claims they have destroyed now up to 8 of these launchers. So that is half. Half of the launchers the US sent to Ukraine have been found and destroyed. And people doubting that this is true, just remember the HIMARS is just a truck with a rocket launcher attached to it. It is the same family of trucks that pull the M777 155mm howitzer that Russia has been regularly finding and destroying all across Ukraine. And they've even managed to get one, bring it back to Moscow and put it on display at their Army Expo this year. And so these HIMARS are most definitely being found and destroyed. Russia claims up to 8. I mean, the United States does not seem like they're sending any more of those. They're only sending additional ammunition. You know, I just did a video about how the West has claimed that these HIMARS are making a huge difference on the battlefield. They're citing a NASA satellite map that shows major fires in a certain area. And so they were showing all of these fires before the HIMARS went active. Then they showed a day afterwards and all of the fires were gone. Almost all of them were gone. And they said this is evidence that the HIMARS has made an impact. It has reduced the amount of ammunition available to Russian artillery. Of course, this is nonsense. If you go to that map, explore it, check several days before, several days after, you will see that day to day, sometimes there are a lot of fires, sometimes there are almost no fires. Before HIMARS arrived and after HIMARS arrived, there are days, including throughout this month, where there are significant numbers of fires. So whatever is causing these fires to appear or not appear has nothing to do with the HIMARS. That is for sure. That is just part of the propaganda campaign the West in general is launching to make it look like something is happening that is not happening. What does the senior defense official during this briefing say about the HIMARS? They say, "We have been seeing Ukraine employing HIMARS masterfully on the battlefield. This long-range fire capability has really changed the dynamic on the battlefield. So we want to make sure that Ukraine has a steady stream of ammunition to meet its needs. And that's what we're doing with this package." But if it was making such a huge difference, why wouldn't you be sending more actual launchers? And the problem seems to be that the West just doesn't have this amount of equipment on hand to just continuously hand to Ukraine. They sent 16, and that seems to be all that they're going to be getting for the time being. And when you really look at what's going on the battlefield, it has changed absolutely nothing. As a matter of fact, let's look at this, again, pro-Ukrainian map. This is liveuamap.com. It is extremely pro-Ukrainian. They will hold off for days, sometimes weeks, to report something that happened in Russia's favor, and any rumor at all whatsoever of Ukrainian success will be immediately depicted on this map. But even according to this map, liveuamap.com, we can see that in the Kherson region where this supposed offensive, a lot of people thought it already went forward. It has not. There is no offensive taking place in or around Kherson. And in the Donbass region, eastern Ukraine, Russia continues steadily advancing. Now, I remember looking at this very map outside of Bakhmut, outside of Soledar, weeks ago, and they were showing Russian forces nowhere near these cities and towns. Now they are showing Russian forces right outside them. So obviously Russia is advancing, even according to a pro-Ukrainian map. Now, keep that fact in mind, that even according to pro-Ukrainian sources, Ukrainian general staff admit that Russian forces are at these locations. Keep that in mind when this senior defense official, speaking on behalf of the Pentagon, talks about Russian advances. The senior defense official announces 16 105mm howitzers going to Ukraine. So the M777, this is a 155mm howitzer. I think that's done. They're not sending any more of those to Ukraine. They sent about 100 or so, and that was it. Now they're sending these 105mm howitzers, which are smaller caliber, shorter range. So if the M777 could make no difference on the battlefield and they send 100 of them, what do you think 16 much smaller guns are going to do? The answer is nothing. It's going to do absolutely nothing. It's just going to be another odd and end piece of equipment that Ukraine has to fit into this hodgepodge of aid that the West is sending them. They're going to have to fit it in somewhere, train someone how to use it, how to maintain it, how to fix it, and where to fit it in on this menagerie of equipment that they've got on the front line. Now, again, 16 guns on a front line that's about 1,000 kilometers or more is going to make absolutely no difference. Ukraine needs hundreds of guns of all different kinds of calibers, 105, 155, whatever the US and its allies have. They would need hundreds of these sent at a time to Ukraine. That is not happening. That is not happening. It hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. The Pentagon also claims they're going to send 36,000 rounds along with these 16 guns. And again, to someone who just hears the number 36,000, they think, wow, that is a lot. That is a lot of artillery rounds. But that is not even how much Russia fires in a single day. It's less. In some cases, according to some, again, Ukrainian sources, that's half of what Russia will fire on a busy day. The senior defense official says, "We have seen the Ukrainians have been able to make great use of this on the battlefield in combination with the previous artillery systems that we provided them, giving them a layered effect with this capability." Again, at this point, when you hear these phrases uttered by the senior defense official at the Pentagon, you can clearly see through it that it is just pure propaganda. They are not sending nearly enough to Ukraine to make any difference on the battlefield. They are just prolonging this, and they're not even doing a very good job at that. So when you hear them saying, "Oh, we sent 16 more guns," this is really going to enhance. They're layered because this is a shorter range gun. It's layers of artillery. They need longer range guns than the M777, not shorter range guns. So this is lip service, and I don't know who's still falling for it at this point. I don't know what it means they're making great use of this on the battlefield when you can see Russia advancing in the east, and this counteroffensive Ukraine was supposed to launch weeks, maybe even months ago, having been perpetually stalled. What does it mean it's great use on the battlefield? I don't know. The senior defense official also announces 15 drones the U.S. is sending. They're called ScanEagles, and they claim this is going to help them with artillery, targeting their artillery. And yes, this type of drone is cut out precisely for that role. But again, we're talking about a 1,000 kilometer plus line of contact, hundreds and hundreds of guns on Russia's side. 15 drones is a drop in the bucket. And can the ScanEagle overcome the electronic warfare capabilities of Russia that have prevented other Ukrainian drones from being used effectively? Not to mention Russian air defense capabilities. Now, this Boeing makes the ScanEagle, by the way. It's comparable to the Orlan 10. There are some differences. The Orlan 10 can carry a heavier payload. The ScanEagle can fly higher and for a couple of hours longer than the Orlan 10. But I would say more or less they're very similar systems. And Russia has hundreds and hundreds of Orlan 10s in Ukraine operating right now. So that's hundreds of Orlan 10s versus 15 ScanEagle drones. And as is the problem with all of these weapon systems being sent to Ukraine, the Orlan 10 is a drone that Russian forces have integrated into their doctrine, have been training on for years and years. These ScanEagles, Ukraine has never seen them before. And this is yet another new system for them to learn how to operate, repair, maintain and repair. and somehow incorporate into their combined arms combat capabilities. Ukraine has shot down Russian Orlan 10 drones. I mean, it's a single engine, very small engine drone. There's nobody on it. It's very small. And if you have any kind of air defense at all, it's very likely that you'll be able to shoot something like this down if they're not careful with it. And if Ukraine can shoot down the Orlan 10, I guarantee you that Russia can shoot down the ScanEagle. So Russia has hundreds of Orlan 10s to make up for any losses. Ukraine will only have 15 ScanEagle drones. Just like everything else in this conflict, Ukraine is at the short end of everything. They got several times fewer of absolutely everything. Now they have several times fewer drones of this capability. The senior defense official says the U.S. is sending 40 MRAPs, and MRAP stands for mine-resistant, ambush-protected. It's an armored transport vehicle. And again, when you think about the scale of the combat taking place in Ukraine, 40 armored vehicles, what difference is this going to make? An MRAP cannot stop a tank round, cannot stop artillery, cannot stop anything Russian military aviation will shoot at it. It can survive running over a mine, maybe, and it can maybe survive a small arms attack. But anything that the Russian military will actually have on hand, it will not survive. And so the reason they're sending 40 MRAPs, and they also say they're going to send, I think, 50 HMMMVs. They're sending these armored vehicles to Ukraine because the armored vehicles Ukraine started the conflict out with are mostly gone, destroyed by Russia. They're also sending these high-speed anti-radiation or HARM missiles. And these are missiles that you generally attach to aircraft. So they're trying to attach these US missiles onto Soviet, Russian-made aircraft that Ukraine has in its inventory, and they're supposed to home in on radar. So they're going to try to shoot at a radar in Russia's air defense network, but again, it's a network, it is layered, and they're going to see this missile coming in. There's going to be other radars also seeing it come in, and they're going to shoot missiles to intercept it and destroy it. Ukraine does not have the number of missiles and aircraft needed to carry out operations where they can trick or overwhelm Russian air defense systems, which is why you're not hearing anything about this. There's no big news story about these HARM missiles, not that I have seen so far. And in case you want to understand the disparity here between the Ukrainian Air Force and the Russian Air Force, Ukraine has a handful of aircraft left. They fly 2 or 3 sorties a day. Russia flies 200 or 300 sorties a day. Again, the disparity between what Ukraine has available to it and what Russia has available to it. The senior defense official goes on to say they're sending 1,500 TOW missiles. Now, these are larger systems than the Javelin. They're kind of elaborate. You got to set them up. It takes a while to set them up. It takes a while to get the infrared sight going. It's got to cool down. And then it's not something that once you fire it, and it's got wires attached to the missile. And you see the missile flying out. You can see some wires attached to it. Once you fire that, you have to keep the sight fixed on the target the entire time. That is how you're guiding the missile to its target. You cannot just fire it and pack up and leave like you can with the Javelin. So this is a much more dangerous system for Ukrainian teams to be operating. And remember, the US flooded Syria with hundreds and hundreds of these TOW missiles, and it made absolutely no difference on the battlefield. Their proxies still lost that war decisively. Now they're sending them to Ukraine. The senior defense official says they're sending 1,000 more Javelins, but again, they have already sent thousands of Javelins. It is not making any difference on the battlefield. The U.S., and I've covered this in other updates, the U.S. in its own papers, the U.S. Army has admitted that trained U.S. soldiers under training conditions have a 19% effective rate when firing all of these different anti-tank missile systems. If you're giving these to Ukrainian troops who don't even have basic soldiering skills at this point, their effectiveness rate is going to be even lower than 19%. So you're sending 1,000, sounds like a lot, but just remember they're going to be hitting and destroying tanks at a rate of much less than 19%. The Pentagon announced that they're sending 2,000 anti-armor rounds, and these are all different types of rounds for all of the different systems that Ukraine already has. Again, if you have 2,000 rounds, but you're hitting and destroying your target less than 19% of the time, is that really a lot? Is that a lot of aid? No. Then the senior defense official starts taking questions. So there's an Associated Press employee there, and they ask about is the conflict really at a standstill? And this is what the senior defense official says. Right now, I would say that you are seeing a complete and total lack of progress by the Russians on the battlefield. This is something that even Ukrainian general staff don't say. They admit that Russia is making incremental advances on the battlefield. So this right here is completely untrue. So in that sense, we are at a different phase than we were even a couple of months ago. You're seeing the Russians still paying, a high price with Ukrainian attacks, especially using that HIMARS system that I referred to earlier. But they are incurring these costs and not able to advance. Again, demonstrably untrue. You can see on even pro-Ukrainian maps, sourcing the Ukrainian general staff, Russian forces are still incrementally advancing in the Donbass region, just as they have been since this began in late February. I've talked about many times this pattern of Russia approaching these heavily fortified layered defense lines. They stop what they're doing and they shell it day and night, every day. They use precision missiles to hit certain targets. They might conduct a ground assault on certain areas of it, trying to weaken it, soften it up before they attempt to overrun it. They may even attempt to overrun it and it doesn't work, so then they start shelling it again. And they do this to minimize losses on their side while inflicting huge losses on Ukraine's side. When they finally overcome these defense lines, that's when you will see a big increase in territory seized by Russia, taking cities, towns, and surrounding areas where these defense lines were holding Russian forces off from. And then they'll reach the next defense line, which right now is the Seversk-Bakhmut line. They're going to work on this line. When they breach it, they will have another huge gain in territory. Now, I wonder what the Pentagon is going to say then when that happens. And then they'll run up against the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk defense line. This is one of the last, if not the last, major defense line that Ukraine has had put up since this conflict really began, not in February of this year, but about 7 or 8 years ago. A Financial Times journalist asks a question because, and in a way, they're throwing cold water on these claims by the Pentagon that everything is going Ukraine's way. They say, Ukrainian officials have told us that they feel U.S. weaponry is not reaching them fast enough to launch a major counteroffensive. I wonder what your response to that is, which, it's funny because the Pentagon is acting as if they're sending so many weapons to Ukraine, it's making a huge difference, and they've stopped Russia dead in their tracks. But it hasn't. And it hasn't helped Ukraine take back any territory either. And that is a question many journalists present at this briefing asked about. Why isn't Ukraine taking any territory back if what you're saying is true? And the senior defense official never answers the question. They just brag about how fast all of these weapons are reaching Ukraine and how over time they're reaching Ukraine faster and faster. And yet it's not making the difference on the battlefield that you think that it should be making. And the reason why is because Russia is destroying it almost as fast as it's arriving. There's another question about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plants, which even Ukraine at this point admits they're shelling. They say Russian forces are there. If Russian forces are there, we're going to attack them. And of course, they're at a nuclear power plant. So when you're attacking Russian forces at a nuclear power plant, it means you're also attacking a nuclear power plant, which is grossly irresponsible. Yet the senior defense official, and we've seen this all across the Western media, they say Russia is so irresponsible. Sometimes they have actually directly said that it's Russia shelling the nuclear power plant, and they do not make it clear to their audiences that Russia is actually holding the nuclear power plant. Their troops are stationed at this nuclear power plant. They have captured it and they have secured it. Now they're being fired upon by Ukrainian artillery. A lot of these artillery systems that the US is sending them, as a matter of fact. But the Pentagon is saying Russia is grossly irresponsible. And then they say, and this is what gives the whole game away, they say, so we have been very clear with Russia that we expect Russia to return full control of this plant. And of course, the surrounding areas. So while the Pentagon claims that everything is going Ukraine's way, and they're turning the tide of the battle, actually they're not. They have no military means at all whatsoever to take any territory back from Russia. So they're using what could only be described as nuclear blackmail to force Russia to withdraw from the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and the surrounding areas without having to use direct military force on Russia. They cannot overwhelm the forces there, but the threat of destroying the power plant by targeting Russian forces, this is what they're going to use to try to force Russia to withdraw. And it just goes to show you how, in actuality, it's America and their proxies, their Ukrainian proxies, they're the ones being reckless. They're the ones doing something extremely dangerous. And keep this mentality in mind when it comes to US provocations toward China. They will be as reckless and irresponsible, if not more so, in regards to China. Just keep all of that in mind. Someone asked a senior defense official about these longer range missiles for the HIMARS. And, if there's all of this success with the HIMARS, how come Ukraine can't take back any territory? Or have they, and we just missed it? This is what they're asking the senior defense official. And they say, we haven't seen a significant retake of territory, but we do see a significant weakening of Russian positions in a variety of locations. And these are all very vague, very unconvincing statements. If this was true, they would have specific places that they could point to on a map and say, this is what Ukraine did with our HIMARS that we sent them. They're not doing that because it's not happening. That's why they're being intentionally vague. And by doing so, they are unconvincing. Now, there's a lot of questions about these acts of sabotage, maybe also a little bit of terrorism across Crimea. And there's a lot of buzz about this because regardless of what the Pentagon and others say about the success Ukraine is having on the battlefield, they actually aren't having any. And so they're clinging to these, I would say, isolated incidents in Crimea. There has been an uptick in these type of attacks. There had been cross-border attacks elsewhere in Russian territory, but this has been going on for months, and it has done nothing to change the course of this conflict. If anything, all it does is justify Russia escalating on their part. Obviously, no matter how many airfields you have, no matter how many aircraft you have, if you lose a couple, it's costing you something. But is it enough to disrupt your operations in Ukraine? And the answer is, so far, no. Obviously, no. Demonstratively, no. Let's take a look at this Washington Post article. Crimea attacks point to Ukraine's newest strategy, official says. And it claims Ukraine is hoping that a new strategy of attacking key military targets deep inside Russian-occupied territory will undermine Moscow's ability to hold the front lines ahead of an eventual Ukrainian counteroffensive to reclaim territory, Ukraine's defense minister said Wednesday. And what they're talking about is this Kherson offensive that has yet to materialize. They have been talking about this for months now, and it has not materialized. And there have been certain points where Ukraine was trying to do something, and the Western media announced that it had already begun, and then it went back to being delayed, perpetually delayed. The Washington Post also claims Ukraine's conventional forces lack the weapons and ammunition needed to launch a full-scale ground offensive to retake territory from the Russians. Oletsky Reznikov said in an interview. He said he expects that sufficient quantities will eventually be delivered in line with commitments already made by Ukraine's Western partners. But no, that's not true. The West, this entire time, has been sending entirely too few weapons overall and per delivery. Has been far too few to make any difference at all. They are sending these heavy weapon systems in such small numbers. By the time the next delivery arrives, half of what they already sent was wiped off the battlefield by Russia. There is no accumulation of heavy weapons in the hands of Ukrainian forces. They have far less heavy weapons now on the battlefield than they did in late February. And even then, they couldn't stop Russia. Certainly now, they're not going to be able to stop Russia, let alone take territory back from Russia. That is not going to happen. Just look at the M777s. Out of 100, at least 30 have been destroyed by Russia. HIMARS, half of them have already been destroyed. By the time the last HIMARS rolled onto the battlefield, number 16, half of them were already gone. The article also claims, in the meantime, Ukraine is seeking to erode Russia's military capabilities by attacking the most sensitive military installations from within. But when you look at these military installations, they're very small. Some of them are ad hoc, thrown together at the last minute just for this operation. And by disrupting these small areas, of which Russia has hundreds, you're disrupting one or two of them a week out of hundreds and hundreds of them. You're not going to do anything of the sort. You are not going to be eroding Russia's military capabilities. Of course, they're going to have to do something about security. They're going to have to be more careful about everything that they're doing. But you're not going to disrupt their operation with these type of attacks. So they cannot accumulate a large number of heavy weapons. They cannot concentrate these heavy weapons anywhere on the battlefield to take territory back from Russia. And they cannot concentrate enough high precision strikes, whether it's by missile or by sabotage group. They cannot do enough of these attacks to disrupt Russian lines of communication, their depots and outposts behind their lines. It's not going to happen. And then the article says some spectacular explosions in the Russian-occupied Crimea Peninsula over the past week have drawn attention to the emerging strategy and to the role of Ukrainian special forces implementing it. And they make it sound like all of Crimea is on fire. When they say some spectacular explosions, they're talking about two incidents. One at an airfield, one at an ad hoc depot. You know, if blowing up airports and depots and other types of infrastructure, if doing that is going to win you the war, then Russia is going to win the war first, because they are doing the exact same type of attack on Ukraine. Even if the Western media is not going to report it, they're doing the very same type of attacks on Ukraine, only on a much larger scale, more frequently, and they've been doing it throughout the entire duration of this conflict. If this is going to win you a war, Russia is going to win the war first. Now back to this briefing, Pentagon briefing. There's a lot of questions about the Kherson offensive. How come it hasn't started? What are the reasons for it being delayed? Someone asked if this handful of MRAPs, 40 armored vehicles, if this is going to be what eventually allows them to carry out the offensive. And again, the MRAP is going to stop your troops from dying on a mine, and it's going to get wrecked and you're going to have to repair it, but it'll keep the crew safe, maybe. It could also stop small arms fire. What it will not stop is what Russia will actually be shooting at it if it tries to participate in an offensive in and around Kherson. Tanks, artillery, military aviation, anti-tank missiles. There's a lot that Russia is using on the battlefield that will go right through an MRAP or an armored Humvee. That is not going to help them launch any sort of offensive. And again, it's 40 vehicles within a conflict of this scale. It is absolutely nothing. AFP asks, you said that you didn't see any significant retake of territory by the Ukrainians. Does it mean that they wait for launching their counteroffensive because they need more time for training? Can you give us some details on the training? How many fighters were trained by the US so far? And is it going as fast as you want? And that is another actually very good point. In addition to a lack of heavy weapons, there is a lack of trained manpower. Ukraine's best trained forces have all died or have been injured in this conflict. They have very few well-trained troops left. What is being done about this? They admit that the US is not training large numbers of Ukrainian forces. They're training Ukrainians to use these heavy weapons, and you can see the effect or lack thereof of these weapons on the battlefield. The UK is actually trying to train large numbers of Ukrainian infantry, but they're giving them these crash courses of just a couple of weeks. Basic entry-level infantryman needs at least 4 months of training. Over the course of 4 months, they will train 10,000 Ukrainian troops, but they're training them in small groups every couple of weeks and then sending them back. And then over the course of 4 months, you will have 10,000. Unfortunately, in the course of 4 months, over twice as many are going to perish on the battlefield. So the UK is training troops at a rate half of that needed just to replace Ukraine's losses. So you can see the problem here. It's not just a lack of heavy weapons, it is a lack of trained troops. And then some guy from Politico asks if there's any of these Excalibur GPS-guided artillery rounds going along with the 105mm howitzers. And I understand that these journalists are not specialists in anything, let alone military matters. They are not. But you would think that journalists covering this frequently, at least they would grasp the concept of caliber, that the M777 is 155 caliber, and that is the howitzer that you would fire a Excalibur GPS-guided round from. These 105 round howitzers, you can't fit a 155mm round in a 105mm tube. I mean, it's just like basic common sense. And I just wonder why they're even, these are like, there's no such thing as a dumb question, but that is a dumb question. And so the answer is no, there are no GPS guided rounds going to these 105mm howitzers. And these 105mm howitzers are firing at half the range of the 155mm howitzers they send. So they're sending smaller numbers of less effective howitzers to Ukraine. That's what they're calling aid. That's what they're doing. That's not me saying that. It's the Pentagon saying that. I want to talk a little bit more about this Kherson offensive. I just want to say, before that, let's just say this. I don't want to underestimate Ukraine. I don't want to say that this offensive will never happen. I don't want to try to predict what will happen if somehow they are, expertly preparing this in secret, escaping the watch of Russian intelligence. Somehow they have accumulated huge amounts of heavy weapons and trained soldiers, and they launched this offensive. I don't want to predict anything, but I'm just telling you the evidence that I see right now, there's no way they can launch this. And even if they do, it is going to fall very far short of expectations. And I'm not the only one saying that. There are pro-Ukrainian Western analysts who are saying the exact same thing. These are people like Michael Kaufman over at War on the Rocks, where at one point he said it's just a matter of Ukrainian forces mopping up the Russians and pushing them out of Ukraine. Now his tune has totally changed. He is much more realistic and careful about what he says regarding what Ukraine can and cannot do. And even he is saying that people should temper their expectations about any sort of Kherson offensive, whether it can even be launched or not in the first place, and what it'll be able to achieve even if it is launched. And I am surprisingly agreeing with him on that. I don't agree with him on much. I do agree with him on that. Let's take a look at this Al Jazeera article. Ukrainian attacks in Crimea weaken Russia's military capacity. We were just talking about Crimea. It says a series of apparent Ukrainian attacks and logistical disasters for Russian forces in the 25th week of the war may indicate that Ukraine's promised southern counteroffensive is still viable. So this is the Western media questioning whether or not it's viable at this point. Quite the change in tune, to be honest, despite the absence so far of significant territorial gains for Kiev, of course. And the problem is, and I've already said this, Ukraine cannot concentrate the amount of heavy weapons and equipment necessary for doing an offensive. They cannot concentrate it anywhere in Ukraine to launch any kind of offensive, let alone in Kherson. Russia is prepared for it. They have moved additional troops just in case. They do not have that. They also are not able to concentrate the number of long-range precision strikes needed to significantly disrupt Russia behind its own lines in terms of logistics. They cannot. They cannot. They are not. These attacks are great for war propaganda, great for publicity. They are making no difference on the battlefield. And I want to reiterate, for every HIMARS attack carried out by Ukraine, Russia alone has its own comparable system to the HIMARS. They have the Tornado S. It fires more rockets, it fires them further, and it fires them just as effectively, guided by Russia's own satellite network, GLONASS. They've got more of these launchers. Their troops have trained on them longer. They have better support on the battlefield, both in terms of protection and also logistical support. In addition to that, Russia has short-range ballistic missiles like the Iskander system. Those can hit much further than the Tornado S or the HIMARS. They've got all of their military aviation still available to them. They've got armed drones. They've got cruise missiles that can be launched from the air, from land-based launchers, and from the sea, and from beneath the sea in submarines. So again, if these type of attacks carried out by Ukraine can win a war, Russia is going to win the war much sooner, because they are carrying out many more times these type of attacks, and each attack is many times more devastating. Ukraine is using sabotage groups, improvised explosives, jerry-rigged drones. Russia has, missiles designed specifically to hit these targets at range and create maximum destruction. We're talking about working on two completely different levels here. Now, there are a lot of geopolitical developments surrounding this conflict, but I would defer to the Duran. There's a recent video by Alexander Mercouris about the speeches of Russian President Vladimir Putin and Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu. And he does an excellent breakdown of these speeches. And by doing so, he gives a really good overview of the geopolitical, the global aspects of this conflict, how the US, the EU, Russia, and its allies, how they all fit into this picture. I'm going to put the link to that video in the video description below. What I like to do is try to complement the excellent work others are doing. I go into these military matters because I have a background in military matters, and it is something that I have studied ever since I have been in the military. I like to give insight into those things, and I like to defer to people who have expert insight into political and geopolitical matters. So that will be in the video description below. So will all of the other links that I referenced in this video. So things to watch out for: keep an eye on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and what is essentially Western nuclear blackmail. They're trying to use that to force Russia off of the map militarily without using military force, because they have no military force to do that with, which is the greatest example of just how little this aid the U.S. is sending Ukraine, how little it's actually helping. The fact that they have to resort to nuclear blackmail and terrorism, essentially, to move Russian troops off of the battlefield. Keep an eye on that. Keep an eye on this supposed offensive that Ukraine is perpetually preparing for around Kherson. And of course, keep an eye in the Donbass region. That is where Russia is focused primarily. That is where they're making their advances currently. There are talks about an offensive or encirclement around Kharkov. I have no doubt that they'll eventually at least think about doing that in the future, but I still feel that those are fixing operations. And I feel like they're only advancing around Kharkov because Kiev is peeling forces out of... That's the whole point of a fixing operation, is that if the enemy does pull their troops out away from your fixing operation, you make them pay for it by advancing on the battlefield. So if Russian forces are advancing around Kharkov, it's because Ukrainian defense around Kharkov is weakening, and Russia is making them pay for that. So keep an eye on all of that. It's a lot to keep an eye on. I will continue keeping an eye on it. If you like this video, please like and share. Think about subscribing to my channel. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. If you're watching this on YouTube, please check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I'm on Telegram, I'm on Odyssey and Rumble, and sometimes I will upload videos exclusive to those platforms because they're topics that I can't really discuss on YouTube. Otherwise, I will put the video first on YouTube and share it on these other platforms. If I ever do get kicked off of YouTube, censored off of it really, I will be continuing to do my work on Telegram, Odyssey, and Rumble. So if you're following me on those platforms as well, you will never miss any of my work. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and through PayPal. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's one-time donations, monthly memberships, or even if you're just helping share my work with others or sharing it on, say, Twitter that I'm suspended from, that all helps greatly. I appreciate all of that. I could not do this work without that support, so thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.